All right, everyone, welcome to another edition of Liberty Lens. I am your host, Big John, and we are here in a slightly new design studio, trying to modern it up a bit. You could tell we changed like the headline to make it a little bit brighter for those of you hard to see, and a background mic, sort of just to give it like that lens sort of thing. I don't know how you feel about the digs now, Mike.
I think everything looks fine, but it looks to me exactly like it did last week. So you you had me at hello, but you lost me at new digs. Your your studio looks the same.
Mm,
My shelf looks the same.
there you go.
I changed my jacket. I put on a clean shirt, but that's about it.
Well, at least that's something, right? And before we get started, also want to point out we've moved. We're not at our former place. We're somewhere now. We're starting our own thing called Distant Warrior. You could tell that little logo up in the right hand corner there. So just keep an eye out for that on X. You could still follow us at Big John underscore SXM, at Mike Termott underscore. You could see that on the screen, and also Distant Warrior. We'll put that in the description. Find us on X. Find us on YouTube, and we'll just continue on, Mike, saying what we have to say.
That all
And
sounds terrific.
yeah, it does actually. And to that extent, let's get to today's topics. Mike, the first thing I want to talk about today is that we had the head of the DOJ, Pam Bondi, Attorney General Pam Bondi, testifying before a Senate committee this week. Now,
Is that what you call it? Testifying?
okay, appearing before the Senate committee to do something or other. But in all fairness to her, we have talked about her a lot since she assumed her position there in the Trump administration, and not always in glowing terms. Because I think you and I at times have come to the conclusion that of all the people in the president's cabinet, he might be least well served by Pam Bondi as his AG. And to that extent, I want to go over some of the things the senators on the committee were asking her and her responses, and you give me your feedback. So, first of all, first and
And
you know, you go ahead.
that all sounds terrific and good for you, and I look forward to talking about that. You are right. We have talked about Pam in the past, and not always in glowing terms. And that's notwithstanding the fact that she's smart and skilled and well experienced in terms of being, a public prosecutor with her days as Attorney General in Florida and before that. But I wanted, as a programming note, I want to assure your audience that we are moving on from Pam Bondi. Next week, we're going to talk about foreign policy. We will eventually talk about the shutdown. I think that we're going to have plenty of time to talk about the government shutdown before it's no longer a shutdown. So, no rush there. We're going to wait until the negotiation gets really interesting. And I'm optimistic that we're going to have some really good stuff to talk about with regard to a Gaza resolution soon. So I didn't want your audience to think that we were just fixated on being upset about the National Guard and the Department of Justice.
Right, right. That's a good point because part of the way we decided to structure this podcast, Mike, is to focus on basically one subject per episode, right? Not to go the multi subject
Right.
format. So
But
you're
we don't want
absolutely
to
right.
act like there's nothing else going on. Right.
Right, right. So we usually try to pick things that are going to expire quickly, right? Like things that we think their shelf life is less than a week. So thank you for that. We will attack foreign policy in an upcoming episode. We have that on the docket. To your point, we're going to talk
Yeah, we're
about
going to have good stuff to
everything
talk
else.
about regarding Gaza, and we're going to have good stuff to talk about regarding the government shutdown.
As
Uh,
as as anybody would expect from a good Austrian economist, we will talk about the government shutdown and the economics tied therein very soon,
as though it were a good thing, right?
as if it were a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Spoiler alert, I'm not really upset
Yes.
about reducing the size of the federal workforce, but here we
A-
go.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so let's start off with the first thing, and actually the thing that look people are still clamoring about to get to the bottom of are the disposition of the Epstein files. What's going on with that? A lot of folks now, Pam Bondi, and to be fair, FBI Director Kash Patel, they can't make an announcement or put out a tweet or anything without people responding. That's nice, but what about the Epstein files? It seems to be like on everybody's mind, Mike. So to
Right.
that extent, Democrats did apparently grill Bondi during the Senate hearing. So one of the things, Mike, they kept asking her was, "Hey, you came out guns blazing at the start of this administration, said you had all these Epstein files, you had videotapes, you had public figures on them, you couldn't wait to let people know. You dispatched Kash Patel to SDNY to collect all this information that supposed Democrats were hiding, the whole 9 yards."
Yep.
Okay, so Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat from Rhode Island, asked Pam Bondi directly if the FBI found Epstein photos of President Trump with, quote, half naked young women, referencing reports that he had that Epstein had been showing such images around.
Yep.
And twice directly, Pam Bondi refused to answer
Yep.
and instead decided to respond by accusing White House himself of having Epstein ties. So let's
Yep.
try to break this down slowly. What do you think of that little exchange and what occurred there?
I thought it was terrible for a couple of reasons and expected and appropriate for a couple of other reasons. I think that she went in with a bad strategy, first of all.
Mm,
I think that she was not well served by the people under her who were preparing her to testify yesterday. As someone who has done a great deal of this, I used to prepare financial services executives to appear before Congress. And it, you know, the first thing you have to do is prep your witness to have the right attitude. What is your objective? Right? Start with the objective and work backwards. So, back in the day, what we were always trying to do was to build relationships, right?
right.
These are, what you might call lobbying relationships, or at the very least, relationships in which you're able to communicate, right? Representing the financial services industries, as you know, doesn't make you the darling of the Senate or of the Congress typically. These are extremely regulated, I would argue overregulated
Right.
businesses. And so all you're really hoping for at the end of the day is to open a line of communication so you can describe to policymakers how bad life is under so much regulation and why it's bad for America.
And Mike, I'm
And
sorry to cut you off, but I just want to interject. To that point, a lot of people don't realize this. That's why, especially the banking industry, when you look at their political donations list, it is right down the middle. People who think they favor one candidate or
yes,
the other, they don't. It's 50% to one side of the aisle, 50% to the other, because they want to be in good with whoever is in charge of those onerous regulations, right?
and to your point, not only was it because you were never sure who was going to have power, but in those days, if the Republicans were in power, you still had a shot at getting some Democratic votes and vice versa. Those
Right.
days are gone, right?
Right, right,
Those
right,
days are gone.
right.
So I I wonder what it was that was said behind closed doors the day before her testimony regarding what it is that their objective is.
Now I'm sorry, just to be clear, you're saying you wonder
Pam's.
behind, meaning within the Trump cabinet, the Trump
Exactly.
administration. That's what you meant. Right, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
If she had any communication with the White House, but at the very least, the people with whom she would have gathered the day before to decide on her testimony and her attitude toward it, what do they view as the objective,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Because all of the traditional objectives appear to have not been achieved.
I would say so. Yeah.
If you were trying to build relationships, fail, fail, and fail. If you were trying to communicate a particular message, fail, 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 unless that message was we hate Democrats and we like Republicans. That was the one message that I think everyone took away from that.
Well, that's part two, right? I agree with
Yep.
you on what you said in terms of her objectives. Were you trying to build bridges or were you trying to burn them? I get that. But I was going to ask you, and maybe you want to save it as a wrap up, but keep in mind, how did it play with President Trump's base? I think that
Yeah.
is also a key question here, right?
I agree with you, and I have to assume that it probably played pretty well
Mm,
with the administration's base. I think that a lot of if you, as you and I have discussed many times in the past, I think a lot of Republicans have been frustrated by the extent to which Democrats have behaved in either a silly fashion politically, or tolerated, or in some cases even were driving the politicization of the Department of Justice in the past against President Trump. So to have someone call that out, offer pushback, I think a lot of folks in the base were glad to see it. On the other hand, in the category of two wrongs don't make a right, one has to wonder,
Right.
I don't get the impression, I don't think too many people do, that the president or the attorney general or FBI Director Patel, I don't think get the impression anyone is hiding the politicization of the Department of Justice here, right? They don't seem interested in advancing that. So to your point regarding her pushback, right?
Right.
Gee whiz, she had prepared notes that the cameras picked up, right? She had notes prepared that she brought in there. So all she had to do was open her folder, and she had notes on things that she was going to say to
Right.
each senator of a fairly personal nature, at the very least specific nature, right? How dare you, impugn my integrity when you accepted donations from someone close to Epstein,
Right. Right.
or you lied about your military record,
Yeah.
or you don't seem to, to Senator Durbin, you don't seem to care about the people of Illinois, but President Trump is going to make them safe whether you want them to or not.
Yeah.
Paraphrasing.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was loaded for bear and delivering those bombshells may be an overstatement, but delivering the nastiness right out of the box. They weren't wrap up at the end of her 2-paragraph answers. It was just, I don't feel like answering your question in effect, but here's what I do want to say.
Yeah.
And so it came off as though the only message she was interested in delivering was, I'm here to excoriate Democrats and I'm here to support Republicans.
Yeah, and that's an interesting way you phrased it, because the other sort of excerpts I had was, you mentioned Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. Like, he started out his question by saying, were you directed to flag any mentions of President Trump when you were going through these files, these records, whatever exists on the Epstein case? Were you told to flag the president's name? And she refused to answer twice directly.
Right.
She refused to answer, and instead said that Senator Durbin had been refusing Republican requests for flight logs of Epstein's,
Yep.
the back and forth to Lolita Island. So that was another tense sort of back and forth. She just
Yep.
refused to answer.
Yep.
And then with Republican Senator John Kennedy, so this was the interesting juxtaposition that you mentioned about excoriating Democrats. He suggested to her, hey, have you interviewed Commerce Secretary Lutnick based on claims that he was the victim of Epstein blackmail? So apparently there were these claims like he was involved in something like that. And her reaction was, well, if Kash Patel agrees, then I guess we could interview him, but didn't confirm any pending action. And her tone was completely different, right? It was like, hey, good point, Senator, but we'll get back to you if there's any there, right?
Yeah,
So
there's a lot to unpack in your comment. First of all, the Senator Kennedy exchange was odd because, unlike the other Republicans, he wasn't just fawning all over her, right?
Right.
And suggesting that she do something that she hadn't done yet. And, to the untrained eye, he made it look like he was giving her some instruction that she probably should have a better answer for, other than, good point. Wish I had thought of that. For the benefit of the background of our audience, last week, Lutnick said that he had met his neighbor in West Palm Beach, Epstein, that he found him to be creepy and possibly a pervert, and characterized him as paraphrasing it, something like the world's greatest blackmailer, right?
Right.
And it suggested that either he just had tremendous insight and was able to see the future based on very little, or he had some information.
Right.
And given that Bondi and Lutnick are on in the cabinet together, one might well wonder, well, did you talk to Howard? What does he know? So that was sort of interesting. And by the way, yeah, it probably is a good idea to
Right.
interview Howard. And they're on the same team. It has to be handled behind closed doors, not under oath, not under oath, not under oath, because you're friends and you're not trying to set each other up. But I would think a phone call is in order. The oath thing is important too. You made the point that she didn't want to answer some of these questions directly or at all.
Right.
Consider she is in the midst of prosecuting James Comey for lying to Congress. Think about all that implies. And with what civil servants in the past is characterized as not a good case, right?
Well, yeah, without getting into it, the original EDVA U.S. attorney, a Republican, refused to indict Comey based on the same charges that
Right.
his replacement is President Trump's personal insurance attorney from Mar-a-Lago.
Right.
She is now the acting EDVA. So to your point, they
has brought in prosecutors from DOJ North Carolina to go after Comey, who a few hours ago pled not guilty. Okay.
Right.
So if you're prosecuting James Comey for lying to Congress,
for perjury, basically, yeah.
for perjury, but specifically lying to Congress, not
Correct.
to somebody else.
Right.
And you are presently being asked uncomfortable questions by Congress.
Right.
You don't want to slip up. You're much better off saying, well, you're ugly and I don't want to answer the question.
Right. From a legal perspective, I agree with you.
Because you can't take the fifth. You can't sit there and say, well, I don't want to answer that because I might get prosecuted. You can't say that.
Right. But functionally, you're invoking the fifth functionally, if not
functionally,
legally, right. So I get that part, and I understand that legally, especially with the Comey tie-in, because for those that don't know, the Comey perjury is once removed, right? It's that somebody lied to Congress about Comey lying to Congress because the statute of limitations had run out on Comey being able to be prosecuted for lying to Congress. So it's like this whole thing, right? But having said that, while it is the correct, and I agree with you, by the way, it is the correct legal stance to just refuse to answer or to obfuscate. Again, how does that play with the base? Because Democrats are going to view that Trump is guilty regardless, right? But to the MAGA base, where there's already a large percentage that yay President Trump, but really we want to know what happened with these Epstein files. There is that chunk, right? So to that extent,
and there are people who are pissed.
Yes, absolutely.
There are people who are pissed today who are Republicans because she wouldn't push for, or at least explain why there hasn't been more Epstein-related disclosure, particularly about her boss.
And Mike, just as an aside, real quick, how does President Trump's sudden amnesia about who Ghislaine Maxwell even is in that thing in the Oval Office? Like, how does this all tie together? Because, to me, it's fascinating. Here's a man who, despite all his other faults, has a memory like an elephant. He doesn't forget anything. He doesn't forget any slight. He doesn't forget anything. And when they were asking him, well, would you consider pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell? The president responded, who? Who are you? I don't even know who she is.
Well, all of the people that you would forget, she wouldn't be one of them.
Right. And let's face it, he knows who she is, right? So my point being is, if I'm like average Joe MAGA right now, am I viewing this as go Pam, you're getting back at these dirty Democrats for the politicization of the legal process? Or is it, hey, good for calling out these Democrats, but at the end of the day, did you flag President Trump's name? Are you hiding stuff that you said you had? Is this resolving it with the majority of the MAGA base?
Resolving, no. Splitting, maybe. One of the things that we have all been taught in the professional communications business is that your message has to be consistently delivered.
Right.
You can't say red one day and purple the next day and think
Right.
that you've reinforced your message. So, she's on a roll. She's looking like Miss Republican. We're going to politicize the DOJ, but that's okay because you guys did it and Democrats are idiots and
Right.
everyone's on my side. And oops, oops. Now I've just undermined my whole case because it looks like I'm refusing to answer a question that could be relevant going the other direction. And I think that in that sense, she undermined a lot of what her intended message delivery was going to be. Too bad for her. And to your point, this is eventually going to come out. This is
Yes.
eventually going to come out. If she gets caught lying to Congress, there'll be no mercy, right? You can't go. My point was, you can't go after James Comey and then expect mercy 3 years later, right? To say that
Right.
there are going to be a bunch of people who are upset about prosecuting James Comey is an understatement. And so you can be mad at Pam Bondi for her messaging, for her partisanship, for the politicization. You cannot be mad at her for being an idiot because she's not. So, to your point, if she can't plead the fifth, calling people ugly is the next best thing and just avoiding it. I do believe that in the fullness of time, those like you and I who have gray hair, we've seen enough scandals go full cycle over the years. It's going to come out. You cannot believe that this is all going to get covered up. The best thing for the Trump administration, first of all, the best thing would be to find out that their boss had, never did anything untoward.
Right.
That would be true. It already looks stupid. But the best thing would be to find out that your boss never did anything untoward. And that's completely possible. There's no one suggesting that he has done anything more stupid than considering pardoning Maxwell, which I think is more politically stupid than anything else, right?
Right.
But the next best thing to that would be to run out the clock, so at least you get through this administration before anything really hits the fan.
Right. And whether it hits Vance's fan is another issue, right? I mean,
That is exactly right. And I think that Bondi needs to be careful. Either she's going to have to dot her I's and cross her T's. And I don't think that this administration is given to that sort of attitude. So the next best thing is just to obfuscate and refuse to answer certain questions.
and one last question, Mike, and then we'll move on to the next subject. You mentioned something that look. I've never met AG Bondi, so I have no idea. I mean, I'll derisively refer to her on occasion as Pam Blondie, just in the interest of stirring up stuff on X, right? But you said, you know, that she's not a stupid woman, I think was the term you used.
Yeah.
That she knows she clearly is she's a
She
seasoned
knows how to
prosecutor.
get her bread buttered.
Right, and she's a seasoned prosecutor, right? So does that work against her in the sense that people on the Hill know that she's not an idiot, right? So
Right.
when she gives, quote, and I'll characterize it this way, idiotic responses, does that make them more likely to be like, there is something here? Or does it make them more likely to say, okay, look, she's being political to protect the president. It's never going to get anywhere. Let's just move on.
No, I think that's a really good point. It makes it look like there is something there. It's something else if you send up, a 24-year-old MBA who, can barely spell Washington, and he says, I'm not, you're ugly.
You're right,
Okay.
right.
That's one thing.
Right,
But
right.
when, Pam Bondi is qualified to be attorney general.
Right.
We wouldn't say that about every prosecutor in the Department of Justice this week. And she knows the implications of everything she says. And one more point that you and
Sure.
I haven't touched on yet, which is, however you feel about yesterday's testimony, objectively speaking, there is no denying that it is fundamentally different than AG testimony in the past.
Mm.
the relationship between the Attorney General and the President is something that we've been discussing for weeks. But the relationship between the Attorney General and Congress has never been like this. Has never been like this.
You mean adversarial like this?
Has never been adversarial like this. Has never been stonewalling like this. And has never been politicized like this.
Even
And I
going
think
back,
that
even going back to say Watergate or to Iran-Contra, you're saying like you
never,
never like this bad, right?
never, not, not Bobby Kennedy, not Mitchell, never, never like this,
Mm,
where uh, the adversarial nature of it is driven by party politics, right? It's one thing if your president is the brother or your president is a criminal. In the case of Kennedy and
yeah, Nixon.
Mitchell, right?
Yeah,
You would expect there to be some adversary, kind of
right,
conversations going on, but never in public because you're a Democrat.
right,
I'm going to say, how dare you come after me when you lied about your military record? Never anything like that. There's always been a recognition that there was an obligation not only to have an arm's length relationship with the president with certain counter examples, as I just mentioned, but there's always been this idea that there was an obligation to maintain a certain relationship with Congress. Congress is the one who pays you, right?
right,
Congress is charged with oversight responsibility.
right,
And because of the expected, at least, independence politically from the White House, there was never a reason why you would have an adversarial relationship with Congress. And
right,
to do so would have been viewed as being too politically in bed with the White House.
right.
And so all of that was, so this is really fundamentally different in terms of this relationship. And I believe that we have, that's really the headline in my
It,
mind. That's the
it is.
headline is there's been a huge change, not just with the Trump administration, but since her confirmation hearing. Her confirmation hearing was nothing like this. As a matter of fact, she went so far as to say there would be no politicization of the DOJ because she was asked what would happen if the White House, tried to politicize your actions. What would you say? Would you give them
Right.
pushback? Would you resist it? And she went so far as to say, if I thought that could happen, I wouldn't be here. And then she said something really interesting. There won't be any such thing. The White House won't,
Right.
it's not going to happen. Well, a different ship is in port.
Mike, do you think that on the part of the administration, do you think this is in some weird way reminiscent of Nixon, who was more worried about the appearance of impropriety than perhaps impropriety? Like, the old saying, Nixon got more in trouble for the cover up than any crime that may have taken place, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and to some extent, the same thing in Iran-Contra. Are we seeing the same thing with the Trump administration?
Yeah,
Where
absolutely. I absolutely think I think Iran-Contra is an excellent example, by the way,
Mm,
where the underlying crime itself was not it was bad. It was
right,
not gigantic, but it was important because the administration had been explicitly told not to do it.
right, right.
Right? By the way, youngsters out there, first of all, ask your parents about Iran-Contra. Number
Right.
two, look up the SNL skit in which the Iranian mullahs are being portrayed by SNL comedians with the mirror image conversation that Colonel Oliver North was facing in Congress in Washington. In other words, North was being grilled, how dare you trade arms for hostages? And the SNL mullahs were grilling their guy, how dare you trade away our hostages for arms? It's hysterical.
Right, right.
uh, the big thing there was not so much what Oliver North did. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of Americans, especially Republicans, thought that he was doing the right thing, which is why he became so popular,
Well,
right?
he became a folk hero of sorts.
A
As a
folk
matter of
hero.
fact, so much that his secretary, Fawn Hall, became a minor celebrity, right?
Yes,
A for her physical appearance, she was a very attractive lady, but at the same time, for helping him destroy evidence before it got to Congress and everything,
absolutely. He
she became
becomes
a
a
folk
folk
hero.
hero because what he did was, by a lot of American standards, not viewed as having done the wrong thing.
Right.
But Congress had explicitly told the White House, "You're not going to do this."
Exactly.
And then North did it anyway and pretended that his bosses didn't know. And to this day, we don't know who knew what. And Reagan plausibly denied being able to remember it, which is completely possible, a la
Right.
Joe Biden. Okay, to your point, is it possible that the White House is more worried about the exposure of something, not because it's the crime of the century, right?
Right.
I mean, let's face it, if Nixon had said, you know what? I found out about this burglary, and here they are. Send them to jail. I'm embarrassed, and I'm going to double down on making sure nobody that works for me ever does anything this stupid again. If he
Right.
says that, he finishes out his term.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely, but he doesn't. He doesn't. He pretends like this is the crime of the century and starts firing people on threat of being exposed, and not
Right.
even the crime being exposed, but his knowledge of the crime. Not even that, but the crime of covering up that he was told about the crime. I mean, it's just insane that he
Right.
melted down over trying to protect his image. And I do wonder, it is completely possible that Donald Trump never committed a crime in the presence of Epstein, right? Never did anything that we would even consider unethical for all we know, but is just so worried about being seen with this guy that he's willing to not only have Pam Bondi distract the world with stupid stuff in a Senate hearing, but pretend like he can't. Oh, I haven't even thought about Ghislaine Maxwell in so long. Well, she's been on TV weekly for 2 years, in case you forgot.
Yeah. In some ways, I had to laugh because there's a great movie called The Death of Stalin, and it's a comedy.
It
And
is a
it
comedy. It's very funny and
Oh,
very
you saw it.
educational
Okay.
for youngsters.
Yeah, yeah. And it reminds me of some scenes of that where they're trying to erase literally what Stalin did in real life, which was erase people from history, edit people out of photos so they never existed. And it seems to me like an almost childish attempt at that. Like, who's Ghislaine Maxwell? Wait, was Epstein? Did I know him? Nah, I barely knew. It's like,
Right.
it's
Who?
like, yeah, who? What? Okay. Now, Mike. Okay, so let's move on from that and go to part two of what really is in the news, which is the president's deployment and federalization of National Guards to Chicago and Portland. Now, this has now they've been deployed to these two states for two different reasons. And on top of that,
Oh, have they, John?
yes. and uh
Two different
right.
reasons.
Right. I'm saying at least what's being stated. But the other thing is it also is important because the administration is gathering up National Guardsmen from other states, not named Oregon and Illinois, to go achieve the administration's goals,
Right,
which
from
also
states that rhyme with Lexus.
right, Lexus, absolutely, and maybe Bama, but basically from Trump sympathetic governors like Governor Abbott, right? Going to states that have very non-sympathetic Trump governors like Pritzker and what's the governor's name of Oregon again? I forget. Anyway, so in the Oregon case, Mike, they're being sent there to protect "quote unquote" federal agents, meaning ICE agents, as they attempt to go about the president's business of mass deportations. In Chicago, the alleged reason is to help protect the citizenry against rampant crime. So let's start off with the Oregon one first, and we'll
Sure.
kind of look at both of them. So in Oregon, I don't think it's beyond the president's scope to send the National Guard, federalize the National Guard, send federal resources to protect federal agents and federal property, correct?
It depends. He has to claim that they are operationally incapable of performing their duties. The threat is so high. You can't just claim, sending 100 guys doesn't do it. I need another 100 guys to protect those 100 guys because I said so.
Right.
You have to claim that federal law is not being enforced because of it.
And in this case, it's the immigration pretense, right?
That's right. And
that
that's why the federal district judge, Judge Immergut,
yes, Karen Immigrant, correct.
Karen, not not uninterestingly, a Trump appointee,
Mm,
has stayed not once on October 3rd, but
yep.
twice, including October 4, has stayed the deployment of the National Guard in Portland.
Yeah, and what's interesting in her restraining orders, Mike, and as you said, October 5th and October 5th, October 4th and October
Oh,
5th.
okay. I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
off.
That's okay. What's interesting is she threw back the president's language that you and I have discussed for several weeks. The president, in announcing this, and the administration in announcing this federalization, said President Trump described Portland as, quote, war ravaged
Yep.
and needing protection for federal assets.
Yep.
And interestingly, in Trump appointee Judge Immergut's restraining orders, she cited no rebellion or invasion, and therefore a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, and the
Yep.
administration is appealing. So I found it
Yep.
interesting that a Reagan appointee threw back the president's war language right back at him and saying, "There's
Yeah.
no invasion here. There's been no declaration of war. Therefore, this is not a legal federalization." Talk
That's
to me
right.
about that. Talk to me because I found that interesting. That little
Yeah, from a
exchange.
Trump appointee. She went so far as to use the phrase untethered to the facts.
Okay.
Yeah. In other words, the judge was effectively saying, I understand the legal argument you're making, right? You are pointing at the right piece of federal legislation. I get that. But the facts don't support that. And in other words, she's pushing back on this idea that the Trump administration gets to define the word insurrection any way that they want.
Right.
For those of you who didn't watch our episode a few weeks ago, the Posse Comitatus Act is the federal legislation that explicitly says that you cannot deploy federalized National Guard against the wishes of the governor unless you declare that there has been an insurrection. And so the president needs to use this word. And by the way, that's why you see the president using the word insurrection yesterday in the Oval Office. And from time to time, he's trying to build the case that there is an insurrection out there. And so the judge is saying that basically, no, insurrection is, she didn't say it like I'm going to say it, but insurrection is a word in the English language. It has meaning, and it doesn't mean what you say it's going to mean. And I think that it's important for us to remember, as we always say, many things can be true at the same time. Portland is a mess. Portland isn't a ravaged war zone on fire, as the president would say. There's not an
Right.
insurrection, but Portland is a mess, and for a variety of reasons. It has been obviously a very liberally politically dominated place for a long time, right? There are those who say the politics in Portland, Oregon are the most liberal in America. And so this is, along with a few other places on the West Coast, where there is experimentation with not cleaning up the cities from homeless people, the decriminalization of marijuana, and effectively the decriminalization of other drugs. It was handled in a ham-handed fashion,
Right.
really undermining the libertarian case, because the libertarian case has been the decriminalization of all drugs, including allowing people to sell drugs, right?
Right.
but the state said it's okay to possess, but still controlled licenses for the sale. And because not everyone could get a license, that meant you still had crime involved with the sale. And it also meant that things went so fast that there weren't resources to help people get off of drugs. And the police were told to stand down in terms of cleaning up homeless people off the street. So today, for all these reasons, Portland really does look awful. It just looks awful. I was downtown a few months ago. It looks like something that requires an intervention. I mean,
Sure.
in fairness, if you saw it, you would say, we need a political change and maybe troops from the outside. I mean, that's your first reaction, is it looks horrible. And so the
Right.
president has a lot of politics on his side in terms of
Sure.
calling for an intervention. But is there an insurrection? No. Is it something that the local police force can't handle? No. It's just that the local prosecutors, the local elected officials, and the local police department have decided they're going to handle it very differently than I think most Americans would. And we need this to play out. This is an experiment in democracy, and we need to be able to point to Portland and say, that didn't work. There needs to be a change. You can't undermine that political system by sending in troops.
Right. And to the point that many, or basically all libertarians and many even conservative Republicans, traditionally conservative Republicans, have always claimed, that's the beauty of our system. You have 50 different laboratories, meaning 50 states, where they can implement what they feel is in their best interest. Now, to your point, some will fail, and it's up to the citizens of Oregon and Portland in particular to say, this isn't working. We need to do something. So we need to switch it up, right? But to your point now, is the cure that the president is recommending worse than the disease it's trying to cure? Meaning that, hey, anytime I find somebody politically unappealing, I'm just going to claim an insurrection and throw this in there. And
Yeah.
again, we'll compare and contrast, but just keep that thought in mind. Let's move to Chicago now. Chicago, as you and I,
One more thought.
yeah,
I need to throw this out there.
throw it out there, Mike.
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman.
Granted.
I was born in Portland, Oregon, where my dad came out of the Air Force. He got a job with someone he met in the Air Force, and he and my mom moved to Portland sight unseen for this job, right? My dad was a very conservative guy, raised by Calvinists, right? Very conservative guys. So they found themselves in Portland. That lasted about 2 years. When I was
Right.
2 years old, we all moved back to Indianapolis, where my dad had grown up. Indianapolis being different from Indiana, but Indiana being one of the most conservative places in the world.
Sure.
And later on moved to Chicago when I was about 6, when my dad started, spoon feeding me Milton Friedman, which is a weird thing. So anyway, now we're to Chicago. Go.
So I was going to say, we're in Chicago now. And you and I had discussed this when the president decided to take over Washington, D.C. And we both said, this is an experiment that is more legally acceptable because D.C. is not a state.
Yep.
The federal government, Congress, basically is the governorship of DC. And we said, but he's using it as a trial run. He's using it as a way to see, like, how much can I push the envelope? How much policing can I have federal troops do, whether it's ICE,
Yep.
National Guard, whatever, Army.
Yep.
And we opined very clearly, Chicago's next. Like, that was so clear on the roadmap.
Yep.
What perhaps, I won't speak for you, Mike, that I view as authoritarianism.
Yep.
That's the next stop.
Yep.
Now it's happened, and there's a little bit of pushback. Whereas you had the legal pushback in Portland, the more direct pushback in Chicago was Governor Pritzker said, "No, we're not allowing this. This is wrong. This is illegal.
Yep.
We're not going to participate. The National Guard will not be ordered to mobilize."
Yep.
President Trump basically says, "No problem. I got a buddy down in Texas who's going to help me out.
Yep.
And to that extent, I think they mobilized 200 Texas National Guardsmen. They arrived in Illinois October 7th,
Yep.
and the first deployments are expected today and tomorrow, totaling roughly 500 troops preparing to descend on the Chicago area.
Yep.
So, Mike, there's a lot to unpack here. I'll start you out with, again, given that the situation here is not to enforce federal law, but to reduce crime as the
Yep.
general purpose.
Yep.
And by the way, statistically, crime, much like in Washington, D.C., has been declining in Chicago, not increasing as the president has claimed.
Crime
So,
has been declining in most places in the United States. But by the way, the big driver, statistically speaking, the most important driver of crime is demographics. And it brings me no joy to report that the vast majority of crime is committed by young men. So to the extent to which your population is dominated by young men, your crime rate goes up, and fewer young men means your crime rate goes down. So it's not because Democrats have been doing a better job than ever before. And I'm not trying to throw Democrats under the bus per se, but the crime rate in Chicago, as in most places in the United States, is down, not necessarily because of great policy, but it does bring up, if the crime rate were higher under Trump 1, why didn't, we have this conversation then? As you and I discussed regarding Washington, if your major concern, if your primary motivator in all of this is to fight crime, you wouldn't handle it the way the White House has. Crime fighting is a team sport, not only at the officer level, but at the agency level. It takes a lot of agency coordination. It takes a tremendous amount of training, communication, both at the individual officer level and at the agency and public communication level. And it requires a great deal of coordination in terms of what our objectives are, what our engagement style is going to be. I don't just mean rules of engagement in a military sense, but what is going to be our attitude toward cracking down on crime. If your major concern were fighting crime, you would be deeply involved with the coordination among agencies, and that just wasn't done. Objectively speaking, that just wasn't done, even to the point of making the chief of police in Washington look silly because she was unsure of the chain of command, for example. So all this was handled in a very rough way. When the Attorney General yesterday said, I wish, you love the people of Illinois as much as you hate President Trump, something like this.
yeah, to Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois.
To Senator Durbin. And she said troops are already on their way, to your point, from Texas. It was to fight crime. Okay. That is explicitly illegal. No opinion here. That's just illegal, right?
Right.
Now, a lot of politics are on the president's side.
Right.
A lot of Americans are concerned about crime. Chicago's crime rate is way too. The fact that it's down some over the last 10 years is little comfort for those who live in Chicago. I still have a lot of family in Chicago. People should be upset about the crime rate in Chicago. We should have greater resources. It probably means that there should have been a pause when talking about terminating certain federal grants for law enforcement purposes that were going to Illinois. As a libertarian, not a fan of those grants, but they're a more efficient and effective way to fight crime than to send troops, which are enormously expensive and untrained. The communication is not there, and the way that they do business is very, very ham-handed. So this is not a good way to fight crime. But the politics are on the president's side. When the troops get there, you're right, starting today, a couple of things. I believe the hearing is going to be tomorrow in federal court, at which we're expecting that there may be a stay, just like in Portland.
Right. There, the U.S. District Judge April Perry,
a Biden appointee,
right? She initially declined an immediate block of the deployment of the National Guard. That was on October 6th.
Right.
But she
In
declined to.
favor of the hearing that I think might be tomorrow.
Right, because she wanted a couple of days to gather more facts and get the
Yep.
get everybody's written arguments and everything.
Yep.
So on October 9th, which as of this taping is tomorrow, she is going to take a look at claims of exceeding Title 10 authority and the Posse Comitatus potential Posse Comitatus violations.
Right.
And Mike, to your point, I think this is a no-brainer, right? Like to your point, there's no war language here. You've already got ICE in there. Now, the only thing that potentially I see as an issue here is that the really aggressive ICE presence and tactics and enforcement, what is it called? Operation Midway Blitz.
Yep.
That one could argue that, not could argue, I think we could all state that the ICE efforts are leading to a lot of these protests and confrontations
Yeah. Yeah.
with the people, right? But assuming that, is there any room, in your opinion, for the argument that, okay, we need the National Guard to escort ICE as ICE discharges its legal duties? Like, is that the better argument?
It is the better argument. You would have to argue that ICE is incapable of going about its business because the Chicago police are not doing a good enough job protecting them.
Hmm,
One could make that argument. By the way, the lack of communication
it's crazy.
between ICE and the police department is the biggest problem in that regard, not the fact that Chicago doesn't have enough police. Chicago has plenty of police, and at time and a half, they're all willing to work plenty of
Overtime.
hours at doing whatever it is the mayor tells them to
Right,
do, right?
right.
But having said that, it does not help your case for Pam Bondi to say this is about keeping the citizens safe. That is an argument that is not legal justification. That is explicitly a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. That does not help your case. It does not help your case that the president has been portraying this as a political phenomenon. It does not help your case that the president is not sending troops to Republican cities. Some progress has been made in that regard. I think the administration took our advice on this podcast regarding Tennessee. One thing that we explicitly said is that they should be going to places where they are more in friendly acceptance to demonstrate that they really have an interest in keeping people safe rather than just rubbing blue noses in the political problems in democratically controlled states.
Right.
So they have a crappy case. The good news for the administration, besides the politics, is that in federal court, the judges rule very narrowly. The judges will not take into consideration the fact that it appears as though the White House is politically motivated, that the Department of Justice is politically motivated, that ICE or DHS is politically motivated. They will not take that into consideration. What they will focus on is whether standing law precludes the administration from doing what it's doing. And I choose my words carefully. They will not look to see whether federal legislation allows the White House to do what it wants. The issue is, does federal legislation preclude it?
Right.
And so that gives the administration a running start. It means the complainant actually has an uphill battle. As a libertarian, that bothers me because I wish federal courts rather would evaluate whether the Constitution allows the federal government to do what it is that the administration wants it to do. But that's a different podcast. So the administration has a shot here, right? If April Judge Perry rules that there's just, it's not clear enough, for example, if she's unsure, and therefore she has to give deference to the administration.
Do you think there's a possibility that Governor Pritzker can call up the Illinois Guard to prevent the Texas Guard from showing up?
There is a possibility. I hope he doesn't do that. I think it's extremely unlikely. This is as close to a civil war as we're going to get this year. The governor and the mayor have said that the troops are not welcome. The mayor has gone so far as to say public land and resources will not be at the disposal of the National Guard. He has said you will not be allowed to use parks, for example. You will not be allowed to use parking lots. You will not be able to use schools for staging. He's been very, very explicit about this. How he intends to enforce that, I don't know, but that's where a lot of rubber is going to meet a lot of road. Now, the officer leading the National Guard deployment, whose name I didn't pick up, I apologize, mentioned in a CNN microphone, I believe it was last night, that he's going to go wherever he wants to go. That he seems to be under the impression that federal law trumps local law, you know, and that's what's relevant. And so for him to get his job done, he's not going to have anybody shutting any doors in his face. My words, not his.
Yeah, and honestly, that point was reinforced several times by Minister of Propaganda Stephen Miller, who said that is always the case, that federal law trumps any state law and that the Guard would not be hindered by any local or state authorities in Illinois.
Right. The problem is that they are confused. This isn't a matter of federal law trumping state law.
Right.
Because there is no federal law empowering the National Guard. It's just an absence of federal law that is strong enough to preclude the National Guard. There's a big difference. There's a big difference, right?
Right.
The only law that matters in this case is state law that says, you know, this is public property and it belongs to the state of Illinois or it belongs to the city of Chicago. And that's it. You know, this is a property rights type of thing. You know, there is no federal law that says the National Guard gets to use a school, you know, when it's in a mood to do so. And so it's real unfortunate. I don't think anyone should be surprised that Steve Miller's mouth got out ahead of his understanding of the law. That's the least interesting and shocking observation of the decade. But one thing did bother me. The National Guard commander making this statement.
Yes.
In my mind, the big problem is not his misunderstanding. That's a huge problem. The misunderstanding is a huge problem. Don't mishear me. That's a huge problem. Huger, however.
Huger. I believe it's pronounced huger.
A huger problem is that he said it
out loud in front of a camera into a microphone. Yes.
Exactly. And there's two problems with that. Let me bifurcate that into problem A and problem B. Problem B is that a lot of people heard it and think, well, he said it, so it must be true, and therefore I have a free hand. And so if I am another National Guard person, I am the White House, I am a Trump supporter, I am a Republican in Chicago, I am under his command, right? All the people that heard it are going to be influenced to believe that it's true and that he's in charge, which brings me to part A of the huger problem, which that he thinks he's a policy official.
Not a soldier, but a policy official.
Thank you. One of the first things that you learn after the police academy, right? In the police academy, you learn a lot of weird stuff. Okay. Then the state tells you you're a police officer, which isn't really quite true. Legally speaking, you're a police officer, but you don't know what you're doing, which is why, you know, you spend all of your hours in a car with someone else, making sure you don't do anything really profoundly stupid.
Right.
Okay. Having been a training officer for several years myself, I can tell you that when people come out of the police academy, they're merely legally a cop. They're not really a cop. Okay.
Right.
One of the first things that you learn after the police academy is shut your mouth.
Hmm.
You do not speak for the department. You do not speak for the city. You do not speak for the state. You barely speak for you. Like, shut up, right?
Right.
We have a communications officer whose job it is to deal with the press. And that person shuts up, right? That person doesn't even say, here's what the policy is of this department. No, the chief of police typically doesn't even say what the policy is of the police department, and he's the one or she's the one
Yeah, it's the PR officer or the communications officer that has
who's
to
going
come
to
out.
communicate all that. And the chief, if she or he is smart enough to know that when it comes to policy, let the mayor's office handle this. Right? If someone doesn't like it, they can vote them out of office. I'm a civil servant. I got to protect my 6-figure contract. Right? Apparently, the commander of the National Guard didn't get this training. Right? He thinks he's a policy official.
Right.
And he's going to go wherever he's going to go. Well, I'm sorry, that's not your decision to make. The rules by which you engage with the good people of Illinois are set by elected officials.
Right.
And so your job is to be quiet, wait for your rules, question them behind closed doors, make sure you understand them. But those rules should, I'm not suggesting that they will, but those rules should include you are going to coordinate with the Chicago Police Department.
Right.
And when this is handled correctly, you view the head of the Chicago Police Department as your boss. Now, that's unlikely to happen, right? But this works well, and I've worked on plenty of, task force operations to know that whoever is on the ground locally, right? You're in a task force and you're from Broward County. In my case, you're from Broward County. You're in Miami, right?
Right.
Yeah. Make sure your boss tells you the local police, the Miami PD, they're square on this. They're good. They're going to have representatives there. We're working like this, right? If you don't have that, what are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, look, in both these cases, it's very obvious what's happening, in my opinion, which is just, to your point, the Trump administration, whether it's good or bad, loves to push the envelope as to what they can do and what their responsibilities are. And to your point, I don't know if it's going to take some sort of Supreme Court ruling at the end of the day to prevent this expansion. But as a libertarian, I just see this really in a negative light, Mike, because I just see that the Trump administration is going to continue on this path, right? Like use ICE as the expedition force into whatever city they feel is next that has way too many Democrat voters, whether it's New York or Tennessee, not Tennessee, whether it's New York or Austin, perhaps, or somewhere, Los Angeles. And ICE becomes the expeditionary force because their actual scope of where they can go under these ridiculous, border security things is basically anywhere in the U.S. Any city in the U.S. falls under that jurisdiction. And then once they're there, you could always claim, well, they need National Guard resources to help them execute their tasks until probably the Supreme Court has to rule and say that's nonsense. And you just saying, to your point, it's an insurrection or they've been invaded, just because you're using that terminology doesn't make it so. I don't know, Mike. That's the way I see it.
Nobody knows that you're wrong. We'll see how this goes. And as you and I have said in the past, it's a shame because the president's libertarian instincts when it comes to so many issues is spot on. He is served poorly by his advisors, by his staff, in terms of implementation, but also in terms of interpreting the law. The American population is with him when it comes to controlling the border and enforcing immigration status related law.
Right.
And all of that is being undermined by the fact that people are doing a really bad job in terms of implementation. You know, you look at this example where ICE was detaining people in this apartment complex that it took over because it got the heads up that there were a bunch of illegal immigrants there. The problem is that no self-respecting law enforcement officer in this nation would have considered living in the same building as illegal immigrants to be reasonable suspicion worthy of detaining people in advance of determining their citizenship status.
Right. 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 Yeah, like we said, it's it's pushing the envelope, pushing it until someone says, and again, it always seems to be the Supreme Court in this position because as we've learned, the Trump administration has proclaimed that every other judge has been compromised by liberal forces, right? By no good Democrats. So there's that as well. All right, Mike. I think we've talked enough about this. Join us again next week here on Liberty Lens, where we'll get to a lot of the issues that Mike mentioned earlier on. We're going to talk about the government shutdown. We're going to talk about foreign policy. We're going to talk about Gaza. We're going to talk about the peace plan the president has proposed for that. We'll get to all that fun stuff. But
we're going to talk a lot of foreign stuff next week. Foreign stuff.
We are. Foreign stuff with a capital S.
From foreign places.
There you go. That's the tease. That's a good radio.
We're on the road. We're going to be reporting from foreign places.
There you go. Fair enough. All right, everyone. Until such time as we are on the road reporting from foreign places, for my friend and co-host, Mr. Mike Maat, this has been Big John. Catch us again next week right here on Liberty Lens. Peace, everyone.